What's up, spooky people? I don't really have anything to talk about today, so I think we're going to just jump right in. Today, we're going to talk about Hampton, New Hampshire's only witch, Goody Cole, or as her real name is Eunice Cole. And she was born around 1590 and died in October of 1680. She is the only woman convicted of witchcraft in New Hampshire. So at the start, her husband was William Cole. There was no record of her having any children, but they also moved to the US while past childbearing age. So it is possible that there were children in England, but there's just no record of them having any children. Both of them were indentured servants of Matthew Craddock, who was a wealthy London merchant. And when their service was over, they were released from Craddock's service and they came to New England. In Boston, they were granted 2 acres of land in Mount Wollaston, which is now Quincy, on February 20th, 1637. And they left for Exeter, New Hampshire, before the end of the antinomianism period. And if you don't know what that is, which I didn't, so I had to look it up. It means doctrine according to which Christians are freed by grace from the necessity of obeying Mosaic law, rejected the notion of obedience as legalistic. To them, good life flowed from the inner working of the Holy Spirit. As we know, back in this time, Puritanism was a huge thing, hence the Salem witch trials and the witch scare that kind of spread all over Europe as well. It started in Scotland, just a little fun fact. So they moved. Soon after they moved to Hampton, New Hampshire, they received 40 acres. The 5-acre house lot was slightly east of where the Baptist church stands today in Winnicott Road. I think I said that right. Sorry if I didn't. And the other 35 was a good source of income. William Cole was a carpenter, so he used all of that as areas that he could, do that. So by the 1640s, William Cole was in his 50s and his wife was most likely in her 30s. There was a really big age gap between them, not unheard of back in that time. The Coles were in court in Salisbury a number of times. Eunice was accused of slanderous speeches. She had insulted her neighbors and had been accused in court. She is known to be extremely cranky and angry all the time, the typical old get off my lawn person. That was Eunice. So the Coles were poor and elderly, but because they owned that 40 acres of valuable land near the salt marshes, it was highly desired. So we can probably see where this is going. So like I described Eunice earlier, she was not a likable person by any means. She didn't have friends. Her neighbors either hated her or feared her. She had an unpleasant personality, and she and her husband lived on Island Path in a very secluded spot. And though their home was secluded, the village children, as you know, as children do, much like what they did with Lizzie Borden, they peered into her windows. They would tell stories of seeing the devil sitting at her kitchen table. And at that point, she was feared by many of the children because of the stories that they made up. Another incident was when Eunice was on her porch and she noticed a boat going down the river with a family in it. The children were chastising her by calling her a witch. She replied to them by saying, quote, "You are brave today, but I hear the little waves laugh and tell me that the broth that awaits you at home will be very, very cold." So the boat continued downstream. There was a sudden storm that caught them off guard. The winds blew at high speeds for about 40 minutes, and then all of a sudden the sun came out. But the boat and the people on board, which were 4 men, 2 women, and 2 children, they were never seen again. So as townsfolk do at this time, they suspected that Eunice was not only a witch, but also dangerous, because they did blame her for this terrible accident. So, for whatever reason for the judgment, she was incarcerated in Boston, and shortly after that, her quote-unquote ancient husband lay near death. She did petition Boston authorities to allow her to go to her husband, and in 1662, she returned to his bedside. But he died. He left his estate, except for his wife's share, to Thomas Webster. There is no record as to why Webster was left the land, but Cole may have felt that the land was safer in a man's hands than a woman's. What a shock. And it is also said that he may have thought that Eunice could be helped by Webster, which separation of rights between men and women set aside, if he did do this so that Webster could, keep an eye on her if Eunice needed anything or if he could help her, then that was kind of a nice little future planning right there, considering he was like 20 years older than her. Also, Cole may have very well suspected that unscrupulous men would accuse Eunice of witchcraft in pursuit of her land as the widow's dower. So he may have given the land to Webster so that way it would stay with Eunice instead of being taken away, because it was easier to take land away from women back then, especially if they were widowed. So the rest of the land, or Eunice's dower, was 1/3 of the original grant of 1640 and fell into the hands of select men who agreed to sell the land to cover the cost of her imprisonment, because you had to pay for your own room and board. And this would leave the unfortunate woman to their ward, to their mercy, because again, back then, you paid for your room and board while you were in jail, and they didn't care if you could afford it or not. They would find a way to make you pay it. So, in stricter standards of the Puritan moral code, she was seen as a foreordained to her shiftless position. And Eunice had not developed friends in Hampton, and for whatever reason, she remained like remote, like a hermit to herself, didn't really socialize. And when she came to trial, there was no one there for her defense. There was no one there to come to defend her. She kept to herself, and because of her personality and people fearing her, it was just Eunice against the entire town. So unlike many cases, one segment of the community attacks a woman from another class. Eunice's accusers included the entire spectrum of rich and poor in Hampton. So it wasn't like rich accusing a poor person, it was all of them accusing one person. So in 1649, Massachusetts Puritans began to take control of the government and in all of the towns, because Puritanism is in. And as a result, neighborhood tension in Hampton and Portsmouth started to rise, especially with all of the witch accusations. Had Salem, which happened a few years after, but I feel like the thought was still there because all of this was happening over in Europe in like full force. So you had Salem, which wasn't too far away, and among the accused was a woman named Jane Walford in Portsmouth, and later that same year in Hampton, Eunice, long associated with the suspicions of witchcraft, was charged as well. Part of the Massachusetts newly revised laws of the colony at the time listed witchcraft as a capital crime. So conviction meant death, which I believe we went over during the Salem witch trials. And death means dispersals of one land. So if someone dies and there's no one to take it, then their land gets dispersed among anyone who they wish to disperse it among. Usually it is the wealthier people, though. Both communities have many members who deeply distrusted the Puritans, and they controlled the government, which is real unfortunate. And there was enough skepticism in both communities that prevented women from being transported out of jurisdiction for trial. Defendants in witchcraft cases like Walford and Eunice were routinely sent to Boston, which is the capital of the colony of Massachusetts, as we all should know, and conviction assured confiscation of property. So Eunice was arraigned to Norfolk County Court in nearby Salisbury, and Walford was arraigned in Norfolk County Court in her neighboring town of Dover. And Dover, if you don't know where that is literally right outside of Salem. So in each case, the husband of the accused was alive, so no land was confiscated. So they had someone in the family that could take it, so their land was safe. But if their husbands had not been alive, it would have been dispersed. In Walford's case, depositions were taken, but no trial was convened, and a year later, Walford was exonerated by a 3 times declaration, and the justices allowed her to continue her independent ways. There was no proof that she intended to or had actually done any harm, but Eunice had lunged at her neighbors, and she had been charged with slanderous speeches. Also, she is childless. She may have also suffered silently in Hampton, where family and children meant so much, and their actions marked her as a mean spirit. So the theory here is that because Hampton was so family oriented and she didn't have a family, whether she just couldn't have children or her children were over in England, she didn't have anyone except for her husband. And seeing everyone else having their families in Hampton and being happy probably made her bitter because she didn't have that. So as you can see, it was probably more of like a sadness, loneliness, jealousy type thing. So Hampton and Salisbury were more severe in their beliefs than Portsmouth, which is where Jane Walford was from, and there was no tolerance for witchcraft at all whatsoever. And they were from eastern and southern countries in England, like Essex County, where witch trials were proliferated over in Europe. the witch trials were very much worse than they were over here. There is no record of Cole's trial. None of it had survived. She was convicted, obviously, of some charge because there are records that show she was incarcerated in Boston. But there's no early provision for the listing of the sentence of death. She was probably not convicted of witchcraft. In her first trial, unlike Jane's case, some harm to domestic animals or maleficium was demonstrated in depositions. The 1656, her first accusation, there were a lot of townspeople that testified against her. So first you have the neighborhood children, and they claim to see her take the form of a dog, a cat, an eagle, and that they had seen the devil sitting, and that they had seen the devil in the form of a black dwarf with a red cap sitting at her table. A man whose cattle had eaten grass on Goody's property, or Eunice's property, claimed that she had put a curse on them. One of the calves had died, another had disappeared, so they blamed her for that. They blamed her for the loss of a fishing boat with all aboard, which is what I explained earlier. The townspeople were convinced of her guilt by the county judge after hearing all of the evidence, sentencing her to life imprisonment. She was 64 at the time, and after being condemned as the Witch of Hampton in 1656, Eunice was confined to a bleak, cold Boston jail cell for much of her last 22 years. When her 88-year-old husband William complained that he couldn't manage his affairs without her help, the court sold his land and paid his debts from the receipts. So like I said, there was no one to defend Goody, in court cases, and a select few believed she was innocent, but they were afraid to come forward because they feared they would be labeled as a witch as well. Because remember, from the Salem witch trials, people who stood up for others who were accused of witchcraft were then eventually accused of witchcraft. Many testified against her, including that farmer whose calf died, Many who testified against her included that farmer whose calf died, two housewives who heard unexplained noises when they mentioned Eunice by name, and Eunice was convicted of being a witch and was sentenced to life in prison or until the courts decided to release her, and she was imprisoned with a lock kept on her leg. So her husband at this point had petitioned for her release from prison because he was in poor health, but the courts denied these requests and therefore sold off his land to pay off his debts with the receipts. She was imprisoned until 1660, but she still was not released until 1662. And when she returned to prison, some testimony from Abraham Perkins of Hampton, New Hampshire. One evening in November 1662, he was walking by the home of Eunice, and he heard two voices in conversation. Eunice had been widowed earlier that year, and obviously curiosity took over, and he wanted to know what she was talking about and who she was talking to. So he paused and he listened. He said, Eunice seemed to be discontented with something, finding fault, and the hollow voice spoke to her again in a strange, unworldly manner, as if one had spoken out of the earth or in some hollow vessel. Perkins was disturbed. He ran. He brought two friends back with him. The three men stood outside, and they say they heard strange things. They said, we three went to her house and hearkened and heard Eunice Cole speak, and the strange voice answered her multiple times. And Eunice Cole went up and down the house and clattered the door to and again and spoke as she went. And the hollow voice made her answer in a strange manner. And there was a shimmering of red color in the chimney corner. And this is quoted from John Demos, Entertaining Satan, from 1982. In 1665, Goody petitioned her release and was granted permission on the condition that she moves out of the jurisdiction of the court. So she moved to the foot of Rand's Hill, where the town provided a shack for her. So ultimately, the blow to Eunice was the loss of her land. And by 1671, Eunice returned to Hampton, and many families did agree to take turns to take care of her. And the townspeople would show obvious resentment toward her, and she continued pleas for food and wood. In less than a year, in October 1672, charges of witchcraft were leveled against Eunice again. So life went on. In 1971, individual families took turns bringing food to her. One family that provided food was of John and Bridget Clifford. There were 13 members of the Clifford family. 11 were children, 4 were different surnames. Among the children was the young Anne Smith, whose mother had died when the girl was an infant. Her father had abandoned her to the Godfrey family, and Eunice may have found little Anne Smith a lonely soul and reached out to her, and Anne certainly had a reason to have felt abandonment. So they also, the Clifford family, took care of orphans and abandoned children. So that's why their family was so big. The town saw only evil possibilities as usual. Poor Eunice. So they were claiming that, again, she was a witch. She was after their children. The women who gave testimony, most of them were in the Clifford household, unfortunately. And the list included Anne Smith herself, Bridget Huggins, and Sarah Godfrey Clifford. And Anna Huggins was Bridget's daughter. She was accused again in 1673 and acquitted, and once again in 1680. Although she was not indicted, she was still kept in prison. Anna Huggins's father was deceased. He was a constable, and he had earlier whipped Eunice. A whipping was a usual punishment for slanderous speech. And another witness in trial was John Godfrey. Godfrey's mother, Marjorie, had been Anne Smith's stepmother at the time. Marjorie Webster Godfrey was also the mother of Thomas Webster, who had gained the Cole estate at the death of the old man, or Eunice's husband. Eunice was a continuous threat alive to the Websters because of the land. So it's no coincidence that this family probably made up these stories. Eunice also supposedly had a penchant for stealing children. At least that's what was said. She was trying to steal children, and they always somehow got away. So testimony from Sarah Clifford of Hampton claimed in 1673, Eunice tried to steal away her 9-year-old Anne Smith, and then the child told her that there came an old woman into the garden with a blue coat and a blue cap and a blue apron and a white neckcloth, and took this girl, as she told us, by the hand and carried her into the orchard and threw her under a pearmain tree. She was asked to live with this old woman, and she said if she would live with her, she would give her a baby and some plums. Quoted from David Hall, Witch Hunting in the 17th Century New England, 1991. Young Anne would refuse Eunice's offer, and in response, Eunice would then threaten to kill her and allegedly struck her in the head with a rock. The girl said that Eunice then turned into a dog, climbed a tree, and flew off. As you can see, this is a very outlandish story. So once again, she was jailed in Boston as she was tried in Essex County Court, but exonerated. And we don't know if Webster hatched the plot or not, if this was planned or if his family plotted it. We don't know exactly what happened. But it doesn't matter. Whatever the cause was, a woman had less political power to fight for her rights in colonial days. And when women did assert themselves, they were seen as overstepping their bounds and ran the risk of accusations. And it's a mark of tolerant justices that Eunice's life was spared. So in the fall of 1980, there was a lot of tension at the time surrounding King Charles II and the separation of New Hampshire and Massachusetts. And Eunice was again hauled off to prison. And the next summer in Portsmouth, Anne Walford had died. But her daughter, Hannah Walford Jones, was accused of witchcraft in Portsmouth, and neither woman was convicted. So remember, we talked about Jane a little earlier. So small communities, 2 different women, just kind of a comparison here of the 2 colonies. So upon Eunice's death, she was hastily buried in an unmarked grave in Hampton, and the precise whereabouts of this grave are unknown and believed to be near the site of today's Tuck Museum. And then local legends suggest that a stake was driven into her body after her death, quote, in order to exorcise the baleful influence she was supposed to have possessed, and a horseshoe hung on the stake just to be on the safe side. And horseshoes are to deflect negative spirits and energy. Eunice was much maligned. Hampton historian Joseph Doe referred to her as, quote, ill-natured and ugly, artful and aggravating, malicious and revengeful, unquote. but not a witch. So the Boston court did bill the town of Hampton for her room and board while she was in prison. The town did default after 2 years, and Eunice's former jailer arrested one of the selectsmen. The town fathers demanded that the citizens of Hampton who hated and feared her needed to provide for her care, and each week a different family was required to bring her food and fuel, or else pay the value of 4 shillings. This was after she was released for the last time. So one day, according to Joseph Doe's History of Hampton, the smoke stopped coming from her chimney and the food stayed unclaimed at her door. So that's when they knew she was dead. And then they buried her. She died alone in a small hut off of Rand's Hill in Hampton at the age of 88. And again, they don't know where she's buried. It is said that a mob carried her body to a field and drove the stake through her heart, the only way to make sure that they believe to exorcise the devil. Another theory is that local citizens tossed her body in a nearby ditch. Others say they threw her off a cliff into the sea, or maybe she was buried on the land that had once been her 40-acre farm. The town of Hampton took from her to pay the cost of confining her in the Boston cell. In all versions of the legend, the citizens of colonial Hampton discovered the body of a witch and drove a wooden stake through her heart, then hung a horseshoe to protect themselves from retribution. Eunice had remained quiet for 225 years, but then the Fogg family moved into a house that was built on the land where Eunice's house had stood at one point, and they stated that they encountered bad luck from the day they moved into the house. No history of the region fails to mention Eunice, but it was John Greeley Whittier who immortalized her in his 1864 poems. The Changeling and Wreck of the River Mouth is one of those poems. And in those passages, Eunice transforms a baby into a demon and causes a shipwreck that resulted in the deaths of 8 Hampton residents. In 1908, Hampton man reported that since building his house on the site of the Coles hut, he didn't have anything but bad luck, and he was sure that Eunice's spirit still cursed the place. He also said that she might be buried on his property, and that made him very nervous. A ceremony was held to exonerate Eunice, and her name was officially cleared. It was cleared of all charges of witchcraft, and replicas of her trial documents were burned as a form of an apology. Then the ashes were mixed with soil from the coal farm and then stored in an urn in the Tuck Museum as a reminder of this tragic story. And this was held in 1938 when Hampton celebrated its 300th year, and a group was formed for the purpose of redressing the wrongdoings that were done to Eunice. And the group was called the Society in Hampton for the Apprehension of Those Falsely Accusing Eunice Goody Cole of having a familiarity with the devil. People in anticipation of the 300th anniversary of the Hampton organized a year in advance to clear Cole's name and formed the society. And the society is usually shortened to the Goody Cole Society. And a doll in her image was made and is sold locally. Goody Cole is remembered as the Witch of Hampton, but the town restored Goody Cole to full citizenship, but could not restore her right to land. Goody Cole is remembered. The Great Depression, with its Dust Bowl, dispossessed farmers and homeless vagabonds that sparked America's social imagination and fired enormous interest in the lives and sufferings of ordinary people. It is during this time that Eunice's life story became an object of lesson and injustice, and her reputation was a witch rocketed to celebrity status. She was Hampton's most well-known citizen with a story ripe for exploration, and I believe that is from the Historical Society. In some cases, the story of Eunice is used to discredit early Puritans by demonstrating early intolerance, and despite the belief in witches, early settlers did not panic and let things get out of hand as Massachusetts Puritans did in Salem a few years later. The irony of the story is that women who tried to defend themselves appear in the early records, and in most cases, the good wives remain unknown. A few remember, know, or can name the wife of Stephen Bockler. But even the young children of Hampton still remember Eunice Goody Cole, the Witch of Hampton. So now we get into some of the more recent things. So in 1937, Haverhill, Massachusetts newspaperman William D. Cram invented the endearing story of Goody Cole's magic well, placing it alongside her river shack at the Willows on Sargent's Island. Then, in the early 1960s, just in time for another town anniversary, came a spate of sightings of the ghost of Goody Cole, as well as the installation at the local museum of a large lump of granite in her honor. The two most recent anniversaries that the Hamptons had were devoid of any of Eunice's lore, but she is not forgotten. There is a musical album about her legend that has been produced. Information about her life is one of the top visitor requests at the Tuck Museum, and her story remains alive and well to this day. And she is known. The Witch of Hampton remains just as well known as the local candy store to children. In 2008, a barbecue restaurant opened in Exeter with the same name, Goody Cole's Smokehouse, and relocated in 2006 to Brentwood, New Hampshire. And through the years, Hampton residents have told stories of seeing a mysterious old woman wandering the streets. Once a policeman said he encountered a shawl-covered old woman and warned her to be careful walking on the heavily traveled roads of Hampton. Quote, "I guess I'll get along all right. I've been walking along these roads for hundreds of years," unquote, she said. He later realized that she was no ordinary wanderer. In 1963, the city erected a large erosion stone outside of Tuck Museum, which then sits on the presumed site of Goody and William Cole's farm. So the full legend of Eunice Cole is they say that her body was buried at a crossroads to keep her from causing mischief after death. The citizens of Hampton drove an iron stake through her heart just to make sure the magic worked. They also placed a horseshoe on top of her as well. But it's hard to kill a legend or a fairy tale in 1938 as the Hamptons celebrated tricentennial. Several people claim to see Goody Cole's ghost walking through the oldest parts of town. The town posthumously pardoned her for being a witch that same year. We all know fairy tales aren't true. Neither of these scary stories about Eunice Cole. If anything, the real scary story is how how an elderly woman was harassed and accused of demonic crimes by her neighbors for decades simply because she was curmudgeonly a widow. But even if the stories aren't true, you can still get a thrill reading about the hollow voices speaking from the earth and strange red lights shimmering by the chimney. And there are quite a few books on these legends, and they are easy to find if you want to look up any more legends on Eunice Cole. But that is Goody Cole and her sad life. That was kind of sad. Sad story. But she lives on through Hampton spirits, and apparently you can still see her walking through the streets. So that's all we have for today. Don't forget, if you go ghost hunting, always bring the salt and stay spooky. Chasing Legends.